Hello and welcome. I'm Pip Tomson and you are watching W News, broadcasting live from the Al Arabiya News headquarters. These are our top stories. A ceasefire deal between Israel and Hezbollah is struck as Israel imposes curfew rules forbidding Lebanese people from crossing into the south of the country. The deal, brokered by the US and France, is being seen as a huge achievement in the final months of President Joe Biden's administration. Meanwhile, the UK's Prime Minister says the deal must become a lasting solution in Lebanon, with hopes for a widespread ceasefire in Gaza. And China responds with fury to Donald Trump's planned tariffs as the president-elect promises to crack down on America's fentanyl crisis. After hours of speculation, a ceasefire deal was finally announced late last night by Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Earlier today, residents were starting to make the journey home to southern Lebanon until Israel imposed curfew rules forbidding them to move south. Well, for more on this, I'm joined from Tel Aviv by our correspondent Sarah Coates. Good evening to you, Sarah. First of all, tell me, what has the public reaction been to this ceasefire deal in both Lebanon and Israel? I'm aware of one poll amongst Netanyahu's supporters which suggested that more than 80% opposed it. So are people hopeful that it will at least hold?
Hello there, Pip. We will begin in Lebanon. It's been about 15 or so hours since this ceasefire did come into play, and since then what's been really seen on the ground is a lot of emotion, a lot of jubilation, a lot of joy as these people really try and make their way back down south in the thousands. But really, just to highlight the fragility of this deal is what we have heard from the Israeli Defense Forces in the past couple of hours. As you mentioned, this curfew running from 5 p.m. local time until 7 a.m. in the morning. It was posted on X. It says it is absolutely forbidden to travel south of the Litani River and that any movement in that area exposes you to danger. Now, the statement goes on to say, we remind you that the IDF is still deployed in its positions in southern Lebanon in accordance with the ceasefire agreement, and our forces will deal firmly with any movement that violates this agreement. So really, this has put a dampener for thousands of people really trying to make their way back home, or to what is left of their home potentially, after months of being displaced. Now, here in Israel, we really aren't seeing the same sort of jubilation, the same sort of joy that is being seen in Lebanon. There is a lot of concern among these, especially northern residents of Israel, that not a lot has been achieved here, that these goals to actually push Hezbollah fighters further north have not been achieved. A lot of these people that have been spoken to say that they don't believe it is safe to go home, while we have been hearing from some of these mayors in the north, and they've been saying this is not a ceasefire deal, it is a surrender deal. Pip.
What are the main planks of the agreement? Just remind us, Sarah, and what happens if that deal is broken?
So we're talking here about a 60-day cessation of hostilities. What it does mean and what is being seen on the ground is the deployment of the Lebanese military moving down south beyond the Litani River and before the UN-drawn blue line. Now, they will be there along with UNIFIL personnel to basically push Hezbollah fighters further north, back behind the Litani River, and make sure that this region, this sort of buffer zone, if you may, is demilitarized. Now, during these 60 days, the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces, must actually leave Lebanon. And this is the time that these residents of northern Israel and also, of course, southern Lebanon should be able to return back home. Now, it is after this 60 days, that is, in fact, if it does hold, that it is hoped that there will be other agreements, other discussions on the disputed border and also the maritime border between Israel and Lebanon. But once again, this is an extremely fragile ceasefire and things can change at any moment.
Is there renewed hope now, Sarah, for a possible ceasefire in Gaza? President Joe Biden, he said he really wants to push for that now.
Certainly, that is what we have been hearing from the US president over the course of the last day. He says that this really should be used as a catalyst for a ceasefire in Gaza that is so desperately needed, with more than 44,000 people that have been killed there. Now, with regards to this, we do need to remember the differences here between, of course, Lebanon and Gaza. Lebanon is a sovereign state. That is something that Gaza isn't. And we also do need to remember that there are 101 Israeli hostages still being held in the Strip. And this has really been a major point of contention here in Israel today. A little earlier, there was a Knesset sitting, a sitting of the Israeli parliament, which actually descended into a screaming match between the far-right National Security Minister, Itamar Ben-Gvir, and a number of family members of these Israeli hostages. Now, what we did hear from Itamar Ben-Gvir is he said, I'm not willing to actually do a deal to exchange 1,000 Sinwars, referring there to the former Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar, in exchange for these hostages. And that, of course, caused a lot of anger within the Knesset, as I said, descending into a screaming match. But certainly we are now seeing a lot of focus turn to the situation in Gaza. As you said, we've been hearing this from US President Biden, and he says he'll be working with a number of regional partners. We're talking here about Turkey, Egypt, and also Qatar, to really try and bring about an end to the conflict in Gaza. Pip.
Sarah Coates in Tel Aviv, thank you. So I want to talk now to a Lebanese political strategist, Diana Menem, who I think can join us. Good evening to you, Diana. I do hope you can hear and see me okay. After 14 months, we finally have a ceasefire in Lebanon. What do you make of this agreement, and do you think it will hold?
Good evening, Pippa, to you and to everybody who's watching us. I mean, there are a lot of mixed feelings in Lebanon today, right? So first, there's a huge sense of relief and a lot of hope as people return to their homes and villages. But also there's a huge sense of despair and loss as people find their homes destroyed and discover the extent of the destruction. And as many realize that they have lost livelihoods, properties, family members, only to be used as pawns in a wider regional war. Remember also that in 24 years, Southerners had to rebuild their homes 3 times, in 2000, 2006, and 2024. They are tired. People are tired, but definitely there's a sense of relief, as I mentioned earlier. While Hezbollah is trying to claim victory, like it did in 2006, insisting that the role of the resistance remains pertinent, insisting that if it were not for Hezbollah, then the Israelis would have done much more. Many Lebanese tend to think otherwise and are asking a lot of questions, sometimes behind closed doors. But the people are asking, why did this happen? Why did Hezbollah drag us into this war? And there's a realization that Hezbollah's premise for deterrence, its claim that it can protect Lebanon and the Lebanese, and its banking on the axis of resistance have all been wrong strategic choices that have not only failed to protect the country, but also dragged us into the war.
So, Diana, there's clearly anger and frustration on all sides.
Absolutely.
There is a deal now that is supposed to last for 60 days. Do you see any reason why it won't go on longer than that?
I mean, there's a lot of uncertainty regarding the deal. There are a lot of question marks. Particularly, I think the most salient point will be the US-Israeli agreement on the margins of the deal. There's a lot of uncertainty around that. There's a lot of room for interpretation. And we've seen already today, the Israelis have repeatedly said that they would be basically targeting anything and anyone that comes close to the areas where the Israeli army is still located in south of Lebanon. I believe that there are a lot of gray zones. There's a lot of room for misinterpretation. And yes, unfortunately, this deal could break at any point in time, particularly, as I mentioned, given the uncertainty around it. Now, also, we must note that on the Lebanese end, I mean, today, the Lebanese Prime Minister and the Speaker of the Parliament have both addressed the Lebanese, and none of them have talked about the deal. None of them have discussed the details of the deal. So, yes, there are a lot of gray areas, a lot of room for interpretation, and we can only hope that this is sustainable. On the Lebanese side, this will mean a firm commitment to a deployment of the Lebanese army. It will mean a firm commitment to basically the implementation of 1701, to closing of the Lebanese porous borders. We're going to have to wait and see how this will evolve and how things will turn out.
Diana, what is the Lebanon that you want to see in the future? I mean, enormous challenges ahead in terms of restoring economic stability, in terms of rebuilding. What is the Lebanon that you want to see going forward?
Indeed, there are many risks in the upcoming period in the country. First of all, there's a risk that the reconstruction effort will not be up to par, will not be up to the expectations of the Lebanese. There are a lot of question marks around who is going to help the Lebanese rebuild, particularly that the country has been suffering from an economic crisis for a very long time and is unable to pull off the reconstruction effort on its own. There are many questions around what will the post-war reality in the country be. Hezbollah is trying to return to its pre-war configuration, insisting that it's very important for the Lebanese to maintain basically the premise of the resistance. They are insisting that the role of the resistance is key. But as I mentioned earlier, many of the Lebanese tend to think and want to actually see a different reality. We have been suffering from endless wars for the past 50 years. Today, many of us think it's time for us to stop these endless wars. It's time for us to actually build a state that can have exclusive control over its arms, a state that can deploy a defense policy that is exclusively controlled by state institutions, that can actually rely on a firm diplomacy, on a Lebanese army that is adequately supported and, most importantly, adequately supported politically, and that can actually rely on state institutions. The premise that Hezbollah can protect this country has failed. We need to create a different reality in this country, a reality where the state and its institutions are the sole entities responsible for protecting the Lebanese.
Diana Menem, Lebanese political strategist, really appreciate your thoughts this evening. Thank you very much. The United Nations and Western states have welcomed the Israel-Lebanon ceasefire, which went into effect earlier today. US President Joe Biden, in a hastily arranged address in the White House's Rose Garden, praised the American brokered deal, holding out hope that it brings the region closer to peace. Benji Haya was there.
President Biden with some, in his words, good news.
I'm pleased to announce that their governments have accepted the United States proposal to end the devastating conflict between Israel and Hezbollah.
This is a conflict which has simmered and then raged for more than a year, the deadliest between the two sides in decades. Now, over the course of 60 days, Lebanon's army will retake ground from Hezbollah, with Israeli forces withdrawing from Lebanese territory. The deal's designed to be permanent, to allow civilians to return safely to their border towns. That is, if the truce holds.
If Hezbollah or anyone else breaks the deal and poses a direct threat to Israel, then Israel retains the right to self-defense, consistent with international law, just like any country when facing a terrorist group pledged to that country's destruction.
The White House says Israel has made huge gains in this war, killing senior leaders of Iran-backed militia groups and destroying key infrastructure.
They have been largely successful at destroying Hezbollah's military capacity and leadership, and Lebanon has been pummeled in this campaign. And frankly, there's nothing left for Hezbollah really to do but concede and seek to rebuild.
But President Biden argues neither party can win long-term security on the battlefield alone.
We, along with France and others, will provide the necessary assistance to make sure this deal is implemented fully and effectively.
The fighting began after Hezbollah fired rockets into Israel the day after its ally Hamas launched its deadly attack on October 7th last year. Today's ceasefire, the Biden administration hopes, can pave the way for a separate one with Hamas to bring an end to a year of devastation in Gaza.
Hamas has a choice to make. Their only way out is to release the hostages, including American citizens, which they hold. In the process, bring an end to the fighting, which would make possible a surge of humanitarian relief. Over the coming days, the United States will make another push with Turkey, Egypt, Qatar, Israel, and others to achieve a ceasefire in Gaza, with the hostages released and the end of the war without Hamas in power.
The Middle Eastern conflict erupted during his presidency, and Joe Biden wants to see it end before he leaves office.
And our correspondent Benji Hire joins us now from Washington. Hello to you, Benji. Well, Joe Biden talked there about America having helped to broker this agreement. Can you tell me a little bit more about exactly what their role is in this ceasefire deal going forward?
Well, you're right. It's almost two parts, because along with the French, they had a responsibility in brokering. And now that the time is for the United States to monitor and try to uphold this deal, this agreement that they hope at least is going to go and last beyond the initial 60 days and could be permanent. Note, this does not mean that the US will be militarily involved, that there'll be American troops on the ground. In fact, in that address that we heard from Joe Biden, he said that he has a commitment to the American people not to put soldiers in combat in this conflict. And so instead, the United States, France, other Western partners as well, quote, will provide the necessary assistance to make sure this deal is implemented fully and effectively. Of course, that is easier said than done. And whilst the United States wants to see Lebanon move into the areas where Hezbollah held that territory, and Israel in turn withdraw back across the border so that civilians can return to those border towns, there is this sort of period of a vacuum and also a very fragile ceasefire that could at any point break if either side decide to re-engage in a conflict. And so the United States will want to oversee that, not get involved militarily, but just try to uphold this agreement to make sure that it lasts beyond that initial period of 60 days.
And earlier, President Biden said that the United States is going to make another push to achieve a ceasefire in Gaza. Now, with just weeks to go until he steps down, is there a sense that President Biden wants to get all this wrapped up so he can claim the credit for helping to achieve peace, rather than President-elect Trump?
Look, I think so. And whilst the Hezbollah-Israel ceasefire is an achievement, is a victory, obviously, in the words of Joe Biden, it's good news, it comes as a relief, it is still short of a Thanksgiving miracle for the sitting president, because that bigger challenge still awaits, that ceasefire deal with Hamas. Now, the president says that he will work alongside Turkey, Egypt, Israel, of course, Qatar and other Gulf nations to try to achieve that deal before he leaves office. The thinking inside the Biden world is that this one ceasefire with Hezbollah will pave the way for others. In other words, that Hamas will now find itself, because of this deal, slightly isolated, given that it has a shared connection with Hezbollah. Both are funded by Iran Iran, and both have the same anti-Israel motivation. But in the eyes of Secretary of State Antony Blinken, if Hamas now sees the cavalry isn't coming and that Hezbollah are not continuing with their assault against Israel, there could be a greater incentive for Hamas to sign the deal. But there is no indication, at least it hasn't been made public, that Hamas or indeed Israel are ready to do this within the very short time frame there is left before, obviously, Biden leaves office and Donald Trump takes the reins.
Benji Haya in Washington, thank you. The UK has also responded to the ceasefire between Israel and Lebanon, as leader Sir Keir Starmer says the deal must become a lasting solution, as he calls for immediate progress towards a wider ceasefire in Gaza. Speaking in Parliament today, the Prime Minister told MPs now was the time to build trust and de-escalate tensions.
Mr. Speaker, the ceasefire announced in Lebanon is long overdue, but demonstrates that diplomacy can succeed even in the most challenging of circumstances. We must seize this opportunity to build trust, de-escalate tensions, and push for a wider ceasefire. Mr. Speaker, the ceasefire announced in Lebanon is long overdue, but demonstrates that diplomacy can succeed even in the most challenging of circumstances. We must seize this opportunity to build trust, de-escalate tensions, and push for a wider ceasefire.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about this with correspondent Olly Barratt, who joins me from London. Hello to you, Olly. So we saw a little bit there about the UK's reaction to this deal. Sir Keir Starmer speaking at Prime Minister's questions earlier.
That's right, a cautious welcoming, I think it's fair to say, from UK officials, but also hoping, the Prime Minister, that this may help lead to some kind of progress towards a ceasefire in Gaza as well. However difficult that may be, we've heard a similar message today from the UK's Foreign Secretary David Lammy, also from the new shadow Foreign Secretary Priti Patel of the Conservative Party. She's talked about welcoming the news of the ceasefire in Lebanon cautiously, but also recognising that there is a long road ahead. We've heard from the board of deputies of British Jews in a statement saying that they hope that in due course communities on both sides of the border will be able to return safely to their homes and livelihoods. And going on to say this statement, we pray the breakthrough leads quickly to a wider cessation of hostilities in the region. We've also been hearing from British activists and charities and rights organisations saying that they they believe to see a focus continuing on humanitarian issues and the plight of civilians in Lebanon who've been affected since fighting has been going on. Also today, David Lammy, the Foreign Secretary, has been asked about whether this ceasefire, if it persists, will mean that the UK can renew its support and training for the Lebanese army. And David Lammy has said that he would hope to increase that support over this coming period. He was also asked if the UK might contribute more peacekeeping troops to the United Nations peacekeeping force along the blue line between Israel and Lebanon. And David Lammy not wanting to commit to any extra British troop numbers at this point, but saying that he would take that issue away and look at it and potentially discuss it with some of his key allies. He mentioned Italy, for example, as a country that does have a lot of troops contributing to that UN force, and saying that he'd want to discuss it with allies like that before committing any kind of increase in British troop numbers. But he did say today that he wants to make sure that support now for the Lebanese armed forces can increase as a result of the ceasefire announcement.
And something a bit separate, Olly, that I did want to just ask you about was the Prime Minister is already facing down calls for another election, despite his party only being in government for, what, just over 4 months?
Indeed, and this has come in the form of a petition, which is something that anyone can set up and petition Westminster to consider one idea or another. And the petition has garnered well over 2 million signatures now for there to be a fresh election, just as you say, just months after the last election. And the person who put this petition together said that this should be considered because it was claimed that the Labour Party have gone back on pledges they made in the election campaign. Now, because of the level of signatures that have signed up to this petition, it will be now considered for a debate, but not just considered for a debate in Westminster by MPs. We now today have a date. On January the 6th, MPs will discuss whether there should be another general election because Labour have broken promises they made in the election campaign. Now, that doesn't, of course, mean there's going to be another general election. Indeed, Keir Starmer was asked about this today during Prime Minister's questions, and he pointed to the fact that he thought there'd already been a petition. By that, he meant that there was a general election in July, and millions of people voted for his Labour Party and delivered them a large majority. So this isn't going to change anything. This isn't going to lead to a general election. It's a minor embarrassment, if anything, for Keir Starmer and his Labour Party. But just behind that, the Labour Party also aware that Keir Starmer's personal approval ratings have been falling. The approval ratings of the Labour Party have been falling as well. So they will want, if they can, to try and recover some of the popularity they had leading into the election in the months ahead.
Olly, Barratt in London, thank you for clearing all that up. No election in the UK, at least not for a few years. Thanks, Olly. Let's take a look at some of the other stories making headlines today. A British mother who kept her baby daughter hidden in a drawer for the first 3 years of her life has been jailed for 7.5 years for extreme neglect. Her mother admitted 4 charges of child cruelty at Chester Crown Court in England. The judge told her she had starved the little girl of any love and proper affection. The coast of central Japan experienced a strong magnitude 6.4 earthquake. It hit the Noto Peninsula at around 10:47 p.m. yesterday. Japan's Cabinet Office says there are no immediate reports of damage or injuries and a tsunami alert has not been issued. Abu Dhabi's Zayed International Airport has been named the most beautiful in the world by the Prix Versailles. Other airports included in the list include Singapore's Changi Airport, Boston's Logan International Airport and Kansas City International Airport. And Euro Millions players in the UK are being urged to check their lottery tickets after a £177 million prize went unclaimed. The owner of the winning ticket will become the 3rd biggest national lottery winner ever. Anger and criticism over Donald Trump's plans to increase tariffs continues today as China warns a trade war will leave no party unscathed. The president-elect has vowed to add 10% on all goods coming into the US from China, and it's thought the new administration is keen to tackle America's fentanyl crisis, which primarily comes from China. Well, to talk about this a little bit more, I'm joined by the assistant editor of The Spectator and host of the Chinese Whispers podcast, Cindy Yu. Great to see you, Cindy. Tell me then, what is China's role in the fentanyl crisis in the US? How are they connected to this?
So fentanyl is a synthetic opioid, which means that it can be made by all sorts of combinations of chemicals, and there are all sorts of variations of fentanyl. Before 2019, China was the major exporter of fentanyl, not legally, of course, but in 2019, during Trump's last presidency, China cracked down on that export. So now what it does is actually its companies export fentanyl precursors, which are the chemical components that go into creating the final product. Those components are taken to Mexico, where they are processed and enter the US from there. So China's not the major exporter of fentanyl anymore, but its precursors have proven very hard to crack down on in the year since 2019.
So how has the Chinese government reacted to this news? And as you say, they're not the biggest exporter anyway now, but Trump is targeting them.
Yeah, it's been one of the biggest, thorns in the US-China relationship in the last few years. It's something that has come up again and again with the Biden administration as well. And actually, in the last year, if you speak to people in the administration, they do say that China has made some goodwill gestures when it comes to trying to crack down on these chemical components. But the question is, it's quite a difficult thing to do because you're kind of essentially whack-a-moling various labs who create all sorts of different variations of these things. So regulation is constantly trying to catch up with the latest variation. And then on the other hand, China knows that this is something that is sticking in its US-China relations. So it also tries to use that as leverage. So it's also, at least with the Biden administration, basically saying, if you give us something, maybe we'll do a bit more. Trump coming in now means that, if tariffs are the hard bargain, the stick, if you like, instead of the carrot approach, we'll now see what China does. But I think there's a question of political will, whether or not there is political will, but also capability. As I say, it's a whack-a-mole process.
And do you think it is fentanyl behind Donald Trump targeting China with these tariffs, or is it actually a bit of a smokescreen?
Yeah, it's definitely not just fentanyl, because if it was just fentanyl, then I think a lot of Trump's rhetoric from his first presidency and from the campaign trail would sound a bit different. But I think Trump fundamentally believes that a trade deficit where, the US trade imports more from China than it exports is a bad thing, because he doesn't believe in this kind of idea of mutual trade. He thinks that America should have surpluses with all its trading partners. And so the size of China's surplus with the US is clearly the big target here. And that's why also we see Mexico and Canada being targeted in his latest intervention, if you like, on Truth Social, his social media platform, basically saying that he'll be putting on 25% tariffs on Mexico and on Canada, not because they are necessarily sources of fentanyl, or Canada certainly isn't, but more because these countries now also have increasingly large surpluses with the US as well. So clearly for Trump, he just wants to get on top, and he goes into a negotiation with the threat, with the leverage already there, and then he'll ease off as the partners try to basically give him something in return. It's very transactional.
Cindy Yu from The Spectator, great to talk to you. Thanks so much. Let's bring you the top business news stories now. And the Russian ruble has further weakened against the US dollar and Chinese yuan today, down 24% since August. Earlier today, the ruble was down 0.86% at 106.40 against the dollar, 0.51% at 14.74 against the yuan. That's the lowest level since March 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine. The Middle East's biggest airline, Emirates, has accused aircraft manufacturers Boeing of clipping their wings after a delayed delivery of an order of 777-9X jets. Week-long strikes within the Boeing factory have contributed to the wait. Emirates President Tim Clark told reporters he hoped the problem would be solved over the next few months. The FA has launched an investigation into suspended Premier League referee David Coote. Coote is accused of discussing yellow carding Leeds United player Ajan Alioski the day before he did so during a match against West Bromwich in October 2019. Mr. Coote says he strongly refutes the false and defamatory allegations. And also in sport, England cricket captain Ben Stokes has taken himself out of the Indian Premier League auction, choosing to prioritise his England career. The all-rounder now risks being banned from the tournament for the next 2 seasons under new competition rules. Stokes told reporters he wants to prolong his career in cricket as long as possible and to wear the England shirt for as long as he can. Let's remind you of our top stories. A ceasefire deal between Israel and Hezbollah is struck as Israel imposes curfew rules, forbidding Lebanese people from crossing into the south of the country. The deal, brokered by the US and France, is being seen as a huge achievement in the final months of President Joe Biden's administration. Meanwhile, the UK's Prime Minister says the deal must become a lasting solution in Lebanon, with hopes for a widespread ceasefire in Gaza. And China responds with fury to Donald Trump's planned tariffs as the president-elect promises to crack down on America's fentanyl crisis. That's just about it from us on W News. Thank you for your company. Coming up next, a special interview with Dmitry Medvedev, the Deputy Chairman of the Security Council of Russia, followed by Hadley Gamble's exclusive conversation with the Egyptian billionaire Naguib Sawiris. And join Tom Burgess-Watson for GNT at 14:30 Eastern Time. So plenty more to come. Thanks for joining us, though. A very good night to you.